Hello. Okay, we'll start in a few minutes. Start in a few minutes, and I'll play a clip from Patricia Williams, whose article is on the syllabus this week and is about rights and legal rights and race. And Patricia Williams is a legal scholar who wrote a book called The Alchemy of Race and Rights. And it was a really foundational book in critical race theory because Patricia Williams is a lawyer and looked specifically at cases that involved discrimination against Black women and also involved cases of sexual assault and harassment of Black women. And she thought about race as a lawyer and as someone who is interested in the difference between legal rights on paper and the criminal justice system. So I'll start by playing a clip of Patricia Williams. And this is a keynote speech from 4 years ago.
Hey, everybody. Our first keynote talk today is by Patricia Williams, University Distinguished Professor of Law and Humanities at Northeastern University with appointments in the law school and the Department of Philosophy, and where she also holds the title of Director of Law, Technology, and Ethics Initiatives. Professor Williams studies how and when privatized governance structures may conflict with public and constitutional commitments to fairness, equity, and human rights. She's particularly known for her analyses in the areas of race, ethnicity, gender, and class. The recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant, Pat writes an award-winning column for The Nation magazine entitled Diary of a Mad Law Professor.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's such a tremendous pleasure to be here. So good morning, and thank you. Thank you particularly to Aaron and Ryan for getting me into this room. And of course, my many, many thanks to the amazing Cynthia Dwork.
So if you've just joined, this is a clip of Patricia Williams, who is the author of the article from this week's reading.
I am really pleased to be here, but also quite intimidated. Being among you is hard because I am so aware of speaking a foreign language. And I mean that quite literally. If it's anything I've learned from years and years of talking with Cynthia, is that we use the same words in different ways. We don't mean the same thing by the word equal. We don't even mean the same thing by the word fairness. She and many of you speak in the grammatical operations of computational language, and my native tongue wag. So being here today is a great opportunity to explore what I think of as the translational project that makes talking so much fun for me, and to see if it has resonance beyond my own peculiar curiosities. And so, as a legal academic, I work in a field which interrogates the world largely through the word, both written and testimonial. We spend our lives assembling briefs, delivering papers, writing articles. And when COVID-19 brought most of the world to a standstill, there was a seismic shift in professional priorities. Court cases, conferences, and classes suddenly shifted from the realm of human encounter to that of cyberspatial distance. Lectures didn't feel like lectures anymore. Delivering a paper didn't feel much like an academic engagement. And by its own terms, filing court papers electronically became an oxymoronic performance. And it is not just that the crisis made these procedures taxing and unfamiliar. What we've also felt is that something foundational was undone. The symbols and rituals of professional legitimacy in the law were themselves undermined by delivering this stuff through a non-textual medium like Zoom or Skype or Teams. And the word we use is so apt. We are remote with, from, and to one another. And it's challenging. It's like working behind a giant mechanical mask. It doesn't feel epistolary at all, at least not in the sense that advocacy and the kind of teaching I do usually evokes for most of us. And I hate it, frankly. To me, teaching through my laptop or talking to you now feels like, and I think I told Cynthia this, it feels like I've cooked a nice dinner for everyone, a lovely roast chicken, say, with potatoes and green beans, but no garlic, Cynthia. But then I have to hold it up to the screen, proffering it with a vain imperative. Dig in. Now, of course, many of us are doing that already. I've got digital gifts of cornbread from Seattle, pumpkin carrot cake from London. I have a whole cyber larder of foods I can't eat. In order to perform myself to an audience, in other words, I have to stand inside an exoskeleton of myself. I have to learn to walk with a prosthetic, calculate every interaction, learn how to allow this platform, in effect, my mechanical brain, to translate the subtle intonations, not just of you, my audience, but also of myself. I have to translate and perform in a way that recreates the three-dimensional personality that one takes for granted intra-personas. And it is a rather painful stretch to coordinate myself in relation to this thing in order to make complex communication possible. And maybe I shouldn't say this to this audience, but I feel significantly reduced by having to present myself through a technology, again, whose very name captures the dilemma of distance, of distancing, of distance learning. And so I manipulate this marionette of myself, trying to get my limbs to work just right, not to get tangled or lost in the strings, the chat rooms, and the filters. And worst of all, the machine structures encounters so that I have to watch my own face perpetually, sallow, flattened, and out of sync by microseconds. And it instills a sense of self-consciousness. And this is, in a way, the material enactment of W.E.B. Du Bois's notion of double consciousness, as he called it, in his book, The Souls of Black Folk. That is to say that somebody is always watching you or surveying you. And I am always now watching myself as I watch others watching me. And that can be stressful. It is a stress. And it is, I think, part of the stress of being Black. One sees that actually echoed in many of the demonstrations one sees on the streets. And it is a feature of this technology that we are now all increasingly stressed, all of us. This is not just a racial phenomenon, stressed by being seen all the time, sorted and marked in this technologically efficient panopticon. And so to me, these negotiations through mechanical filters also feel like a form of aphasia. I have to carefully plug my lovely words into the jittery, staticky medium of Blackboard or Microsoft Teams and hope that the right sounds and the right sights are what come out of the multiple mechanical mouths set up in the multiple kitchens, bedrooms, studies, and gardens on all the other ends. We are partialized and stuttered in this rather literal way. And just so, justice interrupted seems legion these days. Machines have become both agents and witnesses in ways that are difficult to cross-examine for us as lawyers. Digitized images are commonly treated as transparent transmitters of truth, with no resources available for forensic analysis or chain of custody and handling. Where errors occur, it's one thing to work it out and correct it as a puzzle in the lab, but on the ground, there is frequently no amnesty, no forgiveness, a limited right to be forgotten in an online world where one's worst choices and lowest moments live beyond one, eternally haunting in cyberspace. So I think that the thoughtfulness in assembling this organization might help me decipher, might help lawyers, the system of governance generally, of all of us as a society, decipher the norms embedded in the syntax and semantics of justice as a system of governance, and to then reassemble them for application in algorithmic platforms. And so I think of print media, visual media, and numeric representations, each existing in different discourses or languages. And these parallel universes operate according to their own logics, their own referential and connotative systems, including tolerance for ambiguity, how meaning is paired with form, perspective, compositional, and framing conventions, uses of active or passive voice, and relations to past, present, and future. And I'm concerned that democratic values, such as those contained in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, or human rights conventions, are being sidelined in a world rapidly shifting from print or verbal systems of communication to digitized visual technologies and vocabularies and quantitative discourses of numeracy as the dominant languages. So law as a system we teach in law school, for example, regulates provocative, untrue, or inflammatory representations through the rules of evidence. But those rules are bewildered by social media representations of individuals' ideologies and political issues.
We can ask what citizenship means in this time period. And it's something that we've discussed in the last two lectures. And we've discussed the plight of refugees, but also the idea of citizenship. George Floyd was born in the United States of America. He was a citizen of the United States of America on paper and in years of paying taxes whenever he bought something. The fact that visual evidence is now used to condemn people is really terrifying. And I think there is a huge disjuncture between paperwork, meaning your citizenship, but also every time you're buying something, you're paying taxes in a certain country, as opposed to the image on screen. And I think it's interesting to consider the relationship between how much, or it's interesting to consider what happens to our minds when we see so many images on screen and then we see people in the public sphere. Does our over-reliance on images on the screen change how we treat people in the public sphere? And does it compromise the rights of citizenship?
Justice itself is bewildered by hyper exposure at the hands of data stalkers, anonymous cyber attacks, invasions of financial privacy, and revenge porn, and now murder porn, actually, circulated to millions. Fairness is bewildered by the near impossibility of challenging misidentifications made by proprietary algorithms that assort who's in and who's out in life-altering ways and that are not appealable. And these assortments impose new and presently impermeable, not necessarily, but presently quite impermeable categories of racial, gendered, and class segregation. And their decision-making power operates outside the traditional realm of accountability defined by jurisprudential notions of human agency. Empirical testing and randomized clinical trials may be confounded by impenetrably privatized black box estimates of cost-benefit risk calculation. And so my long-term work has been in devising a translational system that goes first behind the rules we call law, and then aligns them with, secondly, the aesthetics of visual or digital literacy, and then thirdly, aligns them as well with the persuasiveness of mathematical ascriptions of causation. And I'd like to align these parallel symbolic systems with the ingredients of fairness felt, or a system of a sense of justice done. And I see it as a multidisciplinary project of category alignment and pattern recognition. And I believe that there is a meaning-making grammar embedded in each of these three genres of expression. And so it is my hope to track and translate these gestural, numerical, and legal discourses and to more fully empower, mobilize, and equalize access to vital resources of distributive and corrective justice. And the goal is not, I really repeat, not to conform or fix a universal language of justice. Rather, it's more to map the methodologies by which such designations are made and felt, and to maximize those outcomes broadly viewed as democratic, participatory, and fair.
If you're interested in law school, please feel free to contact me for a reference. Several students I've had in the past who've done degrees in sociology have gone on to have successful careers as lawyers in America, like Patricia Williams, and also in Canada. I think it's an interesting time to consider legal rights, particularly because of this disjuncture between one's life on paper as a worker, as a citizen, as a person, and the images we see on screen and how we treat people as women or as people of color through images that we see on screen and that obviously affect how we treat others in public space.
So, to give this an example, the theatrical space of a courtroom in which we hold our trials, it is what one might think of as a subjunctive space. And again, why I think of this project as one of grammar and translation. Legal fora in most democracies provide a space within which we contest what ought to be, what should have happened, what might be done about particular injuries. And that structure of semantic tentativeness, or what I am calling the subjunctive, is part of why we value process as deliberative. Ostensibly, we take the time for emotions to cool, for all sides to be heard, for mitigating particulars or misunderstandings to be corrected. And the magic of due process in trials is that its ethic is grounded in a grammatical logic that begins with a mood and a tense that hesitates in deference to the conditional. When those conditions and considerations are met, then and only then, a formal decision is made that transforms the conditional into a present tense, as well as the definitive or a conviction. And that rhetoric, that rhetorical resolution, nakedly procedural as it often may be, is a central feature of Anglo-American jurisprudence and broader metrics of justice. And I worry that new technology, or technology in its present iteration, too often removes that access to the deliberation of oughtness and places the mechanisms of decision-making behind proprietary walls. And many of those invisible metrics are based on coded notions of speed, of efficiency, and the substitution of plurals or generalizations or associational metrics for singular review.
It's interesting to also think about the speed of technology as opposed to deliberation. And again, systems that exist in place in Canada, like the system of child benefits or the system of social welfare, as opposed to the credit card. And we now live at a time where technology is not just exciting, it's also a way of spending money. And it's a way of spending money all around the world, irrespective of someone's rights as a citizen to access things like welfare or to access child benefits. And I think this is going to lead to a lot of legal issues in the future because many people in Canada who are citizens of Canada might opt for credit cards and go into massive financial debt. The problem is that they will then have to pay off their debt. And it's interesting again to think about what existed in the past before credit cards and technology, which was the child benefit and social welfare in Canadian institutions that would protect citizens. or permanent residents or people who want to be citizens or permanent residents?
All in all, this transforms the deliberative promise of juridical time and juridical particularity into temporally reordered generalizations about those like you as an abstracted cipher, removed from specifics of time, history, and context. And the singular you is pluralized by this generalization and then reduced to a permanent state, not of subjunctive possibility, but of assigned probability, treated as a fixed status, a redaction to a statistical number whose determinism remains unassailably future-oriented, open-ended, resistant to appeal or particularization. In other words, algorithms may reduce a first trial to what in jurisprudence we think of only its first stage, that is to say, the might, and it freezes all disposition at that moment. Arguably, algorithms circumvent the institutional faith-making and reassurance of public hearing according to rules of evidence that would resolve the conditional and render it, at least ritualistically, definitive by consensus, or by, in other words, the decision of one's localized peers. And so this rapid transformation of norms, networks, and formulations of community raises questions not so much about what the law says, but challenges the very foundations of the law's relevancy to newly imposed logics of autonomous operating systems and mechanical reorganizations. So it runs in reverse too. If I am trapped in cyberspace, you, as computer scientists, are constrained by the reality of politics and laws of private contract and market norms. For example, I was recently at a meeting about COVID-19 recently, and a wide range of academics and researchers had been invited, but it was mostly people from STEM sciences and computer technology, and everybody wanted to help, to kick into action and to use their talents. But here are some of the problems with what I heard in terms of how it was being discussed. The conversation was dominated by a very particular kind of discourse: optimization, game theory. Some spoke of data transparency as mathematical lucidity, but not necessarily the kind of transparency that makes data publicly available. Secondly, the conversation was not only about how to discover knowledge, whatever that means, it was also about the creation and curation of knowledge in the context of a market economy. So I heard people wondering about how to, quote, create demand for product. And so they were speaking the language of selling and persuasion and speed and efficiency. Worst of all, I heard people, from my perspective at any rate, from the juridical corrective justice, distributive justice notion, I heard people worrying about monetizing what they were doing, getting things patented and fast, plant a flag of proprietary rights, and then property, which will then give you the right to exclude. One definition of property in law is the right to exclude, and then to raise the price. Market values, in other words, not values of patient repetition and shared knowledge, eternal testing, and the idea that a cure might be hastened if we saw it as a shared human property, a property without price, an asset that ought not be the football and competitive games designed to see who can extract the highest price, while those who can't pay can't live. Unlike the days of the Salk vaccine, whose formula was made public and free for the entire human population, today we have disaster capitalism in play for ventilators, masks, the water in Flint, Michigan, hydroxychloroquine, as though public health were a swanky accessory or a luxury brand of sneakers or a new Birkin bag. Finally, I heard in this meeting people trying to figure out how to get a piece of the grant pie. People whose labs have nothing to do with and no interest, and they shouldn't have to have interest in COVID-19 per se, but whose funding is being slashed either because of general austerity measures or because everything is being retooled to address this crisis. And that's not necessarily bad, but it is if you're only in it because your 20-year study about Mr. Whiskers, the oncomouse, is going to die unless you rename him Little Mr. Coronavirus. Now, again, these are not necessarily problems for theoretical computing, but they are the tip of a deeper iceberg that does and will touch all of us, touch me as a lawyer and touch you as scientists and social scientists. It's the problem of what Dana Boyd recently described as politics in the sheep's clothing of math. It is the problem of that data. It's the problem that data is not just being assembled neutrally. As she put it, data isn't gathered, it is made. One final example of the risks of reductiveness as a translational matter. Many of us use Canvas, for example, as a platform to interact with students, through which assignments, readings, group discussions can be shared with students. But Canvas monitors response to and with its usage as a value in and of itself. In other words, it is gauging its own success as it gauges ours. And it displaces and devalues what cannot be tracked by its metrics. In learning how to use it at my institution, I noticed that there was a numerical ranking of my colleagues based on how much their, quote, traffic their lectures generated. And I began to see that that is not just a site for social connection, but also a ranking mechanism in some relatively hidden system of institutional merit. But I wasn't even told that this was even a thing. When they were teaching me the system, I just happened to notice and ask what this obvious numerical ranking of faculty, obvious yet located so far over in the margin as to be almost beyond the frame, what might that refer to? And it is akin, I think, to what some schools more openly value as a way of keeping the institution the subject of buzz. Faculty with highly trafficked Twitter feeds or social media presences will be more valued. We all want to be more cited, but until this kind of data gathering gained primacy, citation was ostensibly about substance argument.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there. When I post these slides online from the lecture, I will post the full talk, and hopefully, if you're interested, you can watch it, particularly if you have interest in law school. Patricia Williams' writings are really interesting, particularly as a lawyer. So in the article, Patricia Williams begins by discussing humor. And Williams discusses the ways that race and racism often becomes a laughing matter for some, while a very serious matter for others. She writes, I raised several issues: racism among my students, my difficulty in dealing with it by myself, and my need for support from colleagues. I was told by a white professor that we should be able to break the anxiety by just laughing about it. Another nodded in agreement and added, the key is not to take this sort of thing too seriously. So my PhD dissertation was actually about humor and race, and I drew on Sigmund Freud's essay, Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious. What I argued was that humor is actually about anxiety, that many people tell jokes when they're anxious about something, and the joke alleviates anxiety, but it does not relieve anxiety. So jokes about sex, jokes about the body, jokes about race, jokes about used to alleviate the kind of anxiety that we live with, but will never be fully resolved. So what's interesting about the Williams article is that she discusses the ways that humor is used to manage anxieties about that which cannot be resolved. However, as a lawyer, what bothers Williams is why these anxieties cannot be resolved about race. And she offers cases of young Black women and girls who have been sexually assaulted and victims of hate crime. And she wants to know why this anxiety cannot be relieved using the American law. My faculty colleagues have urged me not to give the voices of racism so much power. Laughter is the way to disempower the forces of evil, I am told. So this idea of disempowering the forces of evil with laughter, again, would take me back to Sigmund Freud and a lot of theories about laughter and the mind, that when something really cannot be resolved, we tell jokes about it. We often tell jokes about things that just can't be resolved, like the weather, or jokes about things, even self-deprecating humor. People tell jokes about the way that they look or aging. This cannot be resolved, but it is not evil. And what interests Williams is why this evil cannot be dealt with using the American criminal justice system. But is it the racism I am disempowering, she writes, if I laugh? Wouldn't this betray the deadly seriousness of all? Laughing purposefully at what is hurtful seems somehow related to a first lesson in the skill of staged humiliation. Racism will thus be reduced to fantasy, a slapstick vaunting of good or evil, except that it is real. So, this idea that we cannot overcome sadism or a real desire to hurt others is what bothers Williams as a lawyer. And I think it should bother most people. Why is there this desire to turn racism into comedy? And the examples that she gives, which are really serious and really disturbing, involve the rape and sexual abuse of young Black women and girls. So the example she gives is this case of Tawana Brawley. And it is a really serious example of a young Black girl named Tawana Brawley who was a victim of sexual assault and hate crime. I should say, I should offer a trigger warning that the description of the Tawana Brawley case involves graphic descriptions of sexual assault and racial humiliation. And the Williams article is really graphic, and it comes after these comments where people have told Patricia Williams over and over again to take it easy and that everything is just a joke. And if you think the history of the feminist movement has often involved lots of women like Andrew Dworkin, who unfortunately passed away, but was an advocate against rape, being told to, yes, take it easy and everything is a joke. And the Brawley case is one of many cases of Black girls who were sexually assaulted and victims of hate crime. So when Patricia Williams was told that racism is a joke or funny, she writes this. What actually comes to mind, however, is a tragically powerful embodiment of my ambiguous, tenuous social positioning. The case of Tawana Brawley, a 15-year-old Black girl from Wappinger Falls, New York. In late November 1987, after a 4-day disappearance, she was found in a vacant lot, clothed only in a shirt and a plastic garbage bag into which she had apparently crawled. She was in a dazed state, not responding to noise, cold, or ammonia. And again, it is really triggering. So if you need to log out, I understand. And when you watch the recording, please feel free to skip over this or to try to read the article in detail. In the time that Williams wrote this article, trigger warnings were not necessarily as popular because people didn't really politicize mental health as much as they do now, which I think is very important. But this is a real case of Tawana Brawley, who was 15 years old and Black. There was urine-soaked cotton stuffed in her nose and ears. Her hair had been chopped off. There were cigarette burns over a third of her body. KKK and nigger had been inscribed on her torso. Her body was smeared with dog feces. The second version came 1 year later after Tawana Brawley tried to complain about her assault. New York State Attorney General Robert Adams stated that there may not have been any crime committed here. A local television call-in poll showed that the vast majority of New Yorkers, the vast majority of any potential jury pool, in other words, agreed with him. Most people felt either that if she was raped, it was consensual, as cruel an oxymoron that ever was, or that she did it to herself. So in these cases of extreme violence that involve hate crimes against 15-year-old Black girls who are sexually assaulted and also victims of KKK, the American media is used to often dissuade young Black women from trying to prosecute their assaulters or their rapists. So most people felt either that if she were raped, it was consensual, as cruel an oxymoron that ever was, or that she did it to herself, as if self-mutilation and attempted suicide or free enterprise private matters of no social consequence, with reference to which the concern of others is an invasion of privacy. It was a surprise to no one, therefore, when a New York grand jury concluded that Tawana Brawley had made the whole thing up. When Tawana Brawley was finally able to tell her story, she remained curled in fetal position for several days after she was found. She indicated she had been kidnapped and raped by 6 white men, nodding or shaking her head to questions. Miss Brawley gave contradictory answers. She indicated she had been subject to acts of oral sex, and after first indicating she had not been raped, she suggested she had been assaulted by 3 white men. Asked who assaulted her, she grabbed the silver badge on his uniform, but he did not respond. When he asked if the badge she saw was like this, he then gave her his notebook and she wrote White Cop. Asked where, she wrote Woods. He then asked her if she had been raped and she wrote a lot and drew an arrow to White Cop. This response was the closest Miss Brawley ever came to asserting to authorities she had been raped. Her family and advisors, however, asserted many times that she was raped, sodomized, and subjected to other abuse. The white men she implicated included the district attorney of Wappinger Falls, a highway patrolman, and a local police officer. This accusation was not only the first, but also the last public statement Tawana Brawley ever made. One may well question why she, a minor and a rape victim, was ever put in the position of making public statements at all. One might also inquire why the Child Protective Services Agency, which is supposed to intervene in such cases, did not. So the term adultification has been used by Black feminists to discuss the ways that when Black children are sexually assaulted and raped, they often become adults quite quickly in order to excuse the pedophilia and the child abuse that is present in these crimes against Black people. Tawana's terrible story has every Black woman's worst fears and experiences wrapped into it. Few will believe a Black woman who has been raped by a white man. We can think about the case of Cindy Gladue we've discussed, who was murdered, and the accused in the case is Bradley Barton. Cindy Gladue was referred to as, quote, a native prostitute over 50 times in a Canadian court of law. Bradley Barton was never referred to as a white man. In one of the more appalling, straightforward statements to this effect, Pete Hamill, while excoriating the racist hustlers, Sharpton, Mason, and Maddox for talking about whites as if they were a monolith, asked, after Tawana Brawley, who will believe the next Black woman who says she was raped by white men, or the one after her? A slightly more highbrow version of the same sentiment was put forth in a New York Times editorial. How can anyone know the depths of cynicism and distrust engendered by an escapade like this? Ask the next Black person who is truly victimized and meets skepticism and disbelief. Ask the next skeptic, white or Black. I would argue that Tawana Brawley was not believed because of her age and because of her class position. The pictures that were either leaked or escaped from the Attorney General's office, the police evidence photographs showing Tawana Brawley as she looked when she was first brought by ambulance to a hospital following her rape, unconscious, dirty, half naked, a censorship ban on the pictures covering only her nipples on her otherwise exposed breasts, her body so open in public, her eyes closed, her face shuttered, her head turned always away from the cameras. The last image is one I saw in the newspaper shortly after the grand jury report had been published of Louis Farrakhan, unkindly captured with his mouth wide open. The story says that Tawana Brawley has surfaced from her long silence and expressed a desire to become a Muslim and will receive a new Muslim name. Mr. Farrakhan, leader of the Nation of Islam, told an audience of 10,000 on Sunday that he rejected the grand jury's findings and he vowed vengeance on those who he said attacked the girl. Louis Farrakhan, a Muslim, said, "You raped my daughter, and I will kill you and dismember your body and feed it to the fowl of the air." The photo also shows Tawana standing just behind Farrakhan. She is wrapped and turbaned in white, the image of chastity, of rigid propriety, of womanhood, submission to rule and ritual in a world where obedience is an unending, complicated affair. There is a prayerful expression on her face, her eyes unreadable, her mouth is closed. The turn towards piety on the part of Tawana Brawley and her conversion to Islam really speaks to the ways in which race is not dealt with as a modern set of ideas. If one took race and racial discrimination against Black women and girls seriously, there would perhaps not always be this return to something outside of modernity. It is possible that one would gain more rights if they were part of India or China or part of Islam than if they were a woman of color. The irony of this in this time period obviously exists in relation to the killing of many Muslim women like Mahsa Amini, who was killed in Iran. On November 24th, 2022, UN Human Rights Council held a special session to address the deteriorating human rights situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran. The special follows an official request submitted on November 11, 2022 by Germany and Iceland, which has been supported by at least 44 states, and among them the required quorum of 1/3 the 74 members of the Council, 16 or more. The special session focuses on the deadly crackdown and widespread protests in Iran that followed the death of Mahsa Amini, who was 22. So this idea of piety and gaining rights by being pious in America as a Black woman is of course met with the irony of someone like Mahsa Amini, who died because of extreme policing of piety. Mahsa Amini died in hospital on September 16th. Mahsa Amini's death has sparked protests across Iran. And of course, this construction of even piety itself is, it masks the deeper desire to just kill women and femicide. I would argue that the desire to kill women is a desire that is rooted in misogyny, and there's nothing that one can do to escape this hatred. Thousands of people have taken to the streets and cities throughout Iran. They've been calling for accountability for Mahsa Amini's death, an end to violence and discrimination against women in Iran, and an end to their compulsory veiling.
These are the big.
I think it's interesting to think about all of these issues together in relation to the law. Tawana Brawley was a citizen of the United States of America, and she was found disfigured, mutilated. Someone had urinated on her. And this is a question of the law. Mahsa Amini was also a citizen of Iran. So the wider question is, does anyone have legal rights when they're a victim of hate crime because they're a woman and perhaps because they're a poor woman and a woman of color? does the law protect everyone?
Because Iran doesn't want you to see. Police firing in the streets, women cutting their hair, burning hijabs in rage, students' demonstrations. People have taken to the streets across Iran, angry at the government after a woman died while in police custody. The BBC has been tracking and analyzing hundreds of videos, mapping the unprecedented spread of this protest movement. The Iranian government has tried to shut down internet access. Disinformation is spreading across state and social media. Here's why this movement is unlike any Iran seen before.
I would argue that this question about law is also about what Williams discusses in her talk about the relationship between the internet and legal rights. If you have enough money, you can own a house in the suburbs. And if you have a daughter, she wouldn't have to be in the street. She wouldn't be seen by anyone. She could drive a car. She could have a private driver, a private gym. It wouldn't matter what she wore, her skin color. It would just be private capital that would protect you. But then the question becomes, what is the point of claiming citizenship or of having laws at all?
It all started with the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, arrested by the morality police in Tehran for wearing her hijab loosely. Multiple sources said she was beaten in a police truck while in custody. The state released CCTV footage claiming no violence occurred and she collapsed from a heart attack. The news sparked fury. At her funeral, women ripped their headscarves off in solidarity. With restrictions on reporting on the ground, videos shared online are vital evidence in understanding how things are unfolding. The BBC and independent media are not allowed to report from Iran. But journalists across BBC Persian and BBC Monitoring have been gathering videos from social media and speaking to witnesses, tracking where protests broke out in the first few weeks. By using landmarks like this monument and these signs, and checking it against satellite images and pictures of the streets, the team can pinpoint the location of protests. We've analyzed more than 1,000 videos and compared our work to reporting from the Armed Conflict Location and Events Data Project, verifying at least 300 protests since Amini's death. In just 16 days, it's clear just how quickly and widely civil unrest has spread across Iran. But it's also the nature of these protests that has been unprecedented. Women publicly cutting their hair off, defying Iranian modesty laws, confronting the riot police, plainclothes officers traveling with police, stopping to violently beat protesters. These images have struck a chord with Iranians. Today's authorities are suppressing mobile data access in an attempt to control the narrative and stifle the ability to share videos online. We could track this by looking at key hashtags used by protesters. They drop off significantly as these restrictions increase. The government have painted protesters as vandals, accusing them of destroying ambulances. The BBC team has found footage showing this isn't the whole picture. People have warned that ambulances are being used by security forces to transport detainees. You can see people escaping from them. Video also shows ambulances driving into police stations. The situation remains volatile. Dozens have reportedly died in the demonstrations, fueling the fury against escalating government oppression. Mahsa's death has created a tidal wave of opposition, unlike anything seen in Iran for decades.
These protests, like the protests after the murder of George Floyd, have really been an exemplary example of social movement activism and the politicization of people, specifically working people and young people, who are demanding answers as to why civilians are killed um, on an everyday basis without any history of committing crime. And especially these protests raise questions about the rights of people in public space. So Saba Mahmood has written an essay about the politics of piety. Mahmood discusses the ways that Foucauldian ethics are central to the ways that people come to manage themselves as a form of ethical reflection. And I think what is interesting to think about is the relationship between the cultivation of this ethical or political subjectivity and oppression. Many people who experience extreme forms of discrimination, like women who experience sexism, people of color who experience racism, and religious minorities who experience religious violence, can cultivate an ethical subjectivity. And Michel Foucault was interested in the ways that ethics is central to the ways that one responds to power. So, in Foucault's writings about the prison system and in his writings about the repressive hypothesis, what Foucault argued is that power doesn't just work against people, it also allows one to cultivate a sense of self. And Michel Foucault was a gay French male theorist who wrote about the repression of queerness and sex among the bourgeoisie of France. And Foucault is interested in the way that this kind of repression was not just met with silence, it also produced a whole series of ways of speaking about sex, and it also produced forms of resistance that led to the cultivation of an ethical self. To cultivate an ethical self is an act of resistance. When one is treated very badly, it would be easy to treat others badly. However, the cultivation of an ethical and moral and legal self, I think, is central to anti-racist activism and to feminist activism and to the future. So the first component, which Foucault calls the substance of ethics, refers to those aspects of the self that pertain to the domain of ethical judgment and practice. The substance of ethics in medieval Christianity, for example, was flesh and desire, whereas the part of oneself most subject to analysis and labor in the modern period is feelings. The second aspect of ethics, what Foucault calls modes of subjectification, subjectivation, refers to the models available for setting up and developing relationships with the self, for self-reflection, self-knowledge, self-examination, for the decipherment of the self by oneself, for the transformations that one seeks to accomplish with oneself as object. So Foucault, as a gay male theorist, is interested in the way that, irrespective of, or perhaps because of homophobia, many people, specifically as a gay male author and intellectual and brilliant scholar, Foucault was interested in how oppression can lead to a heightened sense of self-awareness and actually a betterment of oneself. So when one is assaulted by oppression, they can protect themselves by trying to be better, more ethical, and more intelligent people. As Nicholas Rose has pointed out, this aspect of ethics draws our attention to the kind of authority through which a subject comes to recognize the truth about herself, and the relationship she establishes between herself and those who are deemed to hold the truth. The third aspect of ethics for Foucault pertains to the operations one performs on oneself in order to become an ethical subject, what Foucault calls techniques of the self. Finally, the fourth component of ethics is telos, which is a Greek word, the mode of being one seeks to achieve within a historically specific authoritative model. So, trying to cultivate a mode of being in an authoritative model is an ethical decision where one takes responsibility for oneself and tries to avoid fighting against that which is unfair. So this is a clip about the politics of piety. And what Saba Mahmoud finds is that in Egypt, there is a revival of this pious movement. And it isn't innocent. It is perhaps a response to a great deal of violence that women experience. And when women experience a great deal of violence, including state policing, trying to cultivate an ethical self is really about trying to cultivate a moral personhood rather than responding to violence with more violence or with self-harm.
By 2050, there will be more plastic than
politics of piety has raised some controversy, I believe, in Pakistan. And I think the source of that is, in some part, a misunderstanding of the argument I've made it in the book. And in part from the idea that in order to understand, that if you are spending so much time and effort in trying to understand a form of Islam that many liberal progressive Muslims in Pakistan oppose, then that kind of work immediately is understood to be suspect. So the idea that has angered people is that why am I taking these movements so seriously, and that why am I not condemning them enough? My response to that is very straightforward and simple. My response to it is that I am, if I was to condemn those movements, that does not mean that you or I or anybody has understood them any better. You can condemn as much as you want, but there are a large percentage of the world's population that is persuaded by the ideology and practices of such movements. So my task as a scholar is not simply to denounce, but to try to understand what motivates people to be involved in these movements and to take their practices and ideas seriously rather than simply to say that they're victims of a false ideology. So I think this is one of the reasons that people seem to have difficulty with politics of piety. And I also think that many of the philosophical concepts that I use in politics of piety to analyze this movement are not necessarily very familiar to the readership. So they tend to misunderstand what am I talking about. It is often argued that because of the kind of religious extremism that exists in Pakistan, the solution to it is more secularism. That the reason we are suffering from the problems of fundamentalism and fundamentalist Islam is because our state is not adequately secular, and the population at large is not adequately secular. Now, if you think about how the term secular is used, or how secularism is used in this kind of an argument, it is that secularism is actually the absence of religion, or it is the separation of religion from state. Now, this is an old idea. It is an idea that has existed since in liberal political thought since the end of the 19th century and onwards. But in the last 20 years, this idea that secularism is about the separation of religion and state, or that it is about the absence of religion, as some people would say in Urdu, it's la diniyan, it's non-religious, has really been challenged by scholars. In the Anglo-European literature, this has really been challenged by a whole set of theorists and historians and anthropologists. And they argue that actually secularism is not the separation of religion and state. And in fact, what you have in modernity, in the modern period, is actually the modern state has become more and more involved in the regulation of religious life and religious institutions. And so secularism is not simply the separation of religion and state. In fact, secularism is the increased involvement of the state in the regulation of religious life, such that the state is given the power to be able to say what is proper religion and what is not. Now, when Islamist movements argue or struggle for seizing the state and making state their weapon through which, or their means through which they want to Islamicize the society, they're actually very much a part of the modern conception of the secular state.
So let's stop it there. It's interesting to think about the Tawana Brawley case and Tawana Brawley's conversion to Islam, and whether or not the state and its relationship to race will impact the policing of certain religious minorities now and in the future. So Michel Foucault wrote, "People know what they do. Frequently they know why they do what they do. But what they don't know is what they do does." So I would argue that people know what they do, and they know that they are racist against young Black girls and women like Tawana Brawley. Frequently they know why they do what they do, because they want to maintain a white middle class. But they don't know, but what they don't know is what they do does. So the fact that Tawana Brawley gained more legitimacy and support as a Muslim and a convert to Islam than as a Black girl is really what this kind of divisiveness can do. And I'll play a clip before we end that the New York Times ran after the election of Donald Trump. And it is a clip of Black women discussing race. And it was after the election of Trump and the rise of a lot of really angry comments about race and anti-Semitism as well.
Many choices on booking.com. There are so many Tina Feys I could be. So I hired Body Double.
As a Black woman who was a Black girl, I see the attack on us comes in a very different form. In some ways, it comes in the same form. You know, people do experience racial profiling and police brutality, but sometimes you come across women who have not had that direct interaction. But we're attacked in so many nuanced ways.
So you have internal race issues within our own culture, and then the external race issue, and then your mothering issue around race. So for me, race and being a woman of color is so multi-layered. It's like you can excavate all day.
2 uniformed security guards walked over to us, one white, one Latino, and began to ask us questions about what we were doing in the lobby of that hotel, if we were guests. Quickly responded and said that I was in fact a guest. I was asked details, my name, what room. And it was at this point that I became very upset.
And then you start to wonder, well, what other difference could it be if you're a white cop? I'm a Black female, what else could I have done to piss you off this much? It just starts to then look racial.
We actually had to bring in a white colleague from the Justice Conference before anyone could get an official response from the hotel.
I've had people focus on my hair not being professional enough. I had an executive director actually pull me into a room and it went down a path of like, you know, just letting you know, like, I don't think that you're professional enough. And I kind of had to go through this whole, I had to actually pull back because I felt like I couldn't be emotional. All the other chorus girls were white. And I remember going up to the person in charge of costuming and saying, you know, why is it that we're dressed this way? Why is our hair doing this weird, just lumped together thing, and all the other girls get to do curls and pretty things? And she was like, yeah, but your hair can't do that. And I was like, you never asked me. But it, for me, was really hard because I just wanted to dance and sing and be in the play. And I was being told, like, you're not good enough, your hair isn't good enough, your clothes aren't good enough. And we're gonna make sure everybody notices that you're Black and everybody else isn't.
And that colored my own thinking about myself. And I was like, maybe I am unattractive. Maybe I am like this monster. But then I'd call my mom and she'd be like, don't listen to them. Obviously, I gave birth to you and I'm gorgeous. So obviously you have to be gorgeous. So I like always, like, whenever I always felt bad, I'd always think about that.
There was a huge population of Black girls who weren't dating anyone. And I wondered why that was, because in my eyes, they seemed to be beautiful and attractive and smart and intelligent and ambitious. And it just didn't make any sense to me why they didn't have a boyfriend too. And that same consciousness is also what I'm thinking now at almost 25 years old, like why that's the world that I still see today.
Once you accept your womanness, that's where your power comes from. It doesn't necessarily always come from your academic prowess. It doesn't always come from what you have. It comes from your perception of self. And when you accept that you're a woman and I'm a woman, hear me roar, that comes from a validation outside of yourself. And even if you want to say it doesn't, it does.
My father would buy me books. And before he would give me the books, he would painstakingly shade in the characters in the books in brown crayon. I still have some of these books. I mean, I had like Cinderella, she was brown, like all these things. And of course, as an older toddler, you notice that they've been drawn in because he's not an artist. And he would explain, you know, as much as he could to a 5 or 6 year old why he was shading in these characters to look like me. I don't have a daughter right now, but if I did have a daughter, I would tell her that she's beautiful, that she's intelligent, that she's all of these things all the time, because I feel like we don't hear that enough in the media. We don't get that attention. What I would tell my daughter is not what was ever told me, and not something that I really thought I would ever say. But ultimately, to my girls, I want you to be happy. I want you to find joy in however you define it. Not what I want out of you, not what society imagines of you, not anyone's fantasies of you. Your happiness and your joy, and I have your back.
So I'll return to the Foucault quote. People know what they do. Frequently, they know why they do what they do. So, if why they do what they do is to try to keep the middle class white, the question is why. And I think it is also about a refusal to take certain things seriously. If someone is the best student, then they are. If they're the best academic, they are. If they're the best scientist, if they're the nicest person, they are. This refusal to compete and to use race as a way of not competing I think is a real detriment to the economy into the future. And so, but what they don't know is what they do does. So this kind of entry or this kind of use of race to constantly prevent people from competing fairly and from judging fairly uh, is, I think, really detrimental to the future economy. And it's really difficult to predict what race baiting will do to the future economy. So that is the lecture for today, and we'll have a final lecture on Thursday. I've uploaded your presentation grades. The only grades that I haven't uploaded are late grades. If for some reason I received your assignment a bit late because of you had to send it through email because some of you had very large files that you couldn't upload to Moodle. So I will make sure that your grades are submitted by the end of the semester, which is Friday of this week. And the final assignment is also due on Thursday. So please also upload a mark out of 10 for attendance and participation for your attendance and participation. And I know some of you are in different time zones, and so please give yourself a mark out of 10 for also watching the recorded lectures. Are there any questions about the final or about the class or any comments? We'll have a final class on Thursday. I hope you enjoyed the class. Your work has been really excellent. I was really impressed by the presentations. And if you need a letter of reference for law school or for graduate school, please let me know. Your presentations were very impressive. I'm really pleased by your engagement with academic scholarship at this level. And if you'd like to, if you want a letter of reference for grad school or law school, please feel free to contact me. If you have any comments, please feel free to use the chat as well. I know some people prefer to communicate in writing. Any questions about the final?
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Hi. So I was wondering if we could do a one-on-one section like after class, like a little conversation.
Sure.
I have, yeah, if that is okay.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Are there any questions? Other questions? Okay, so I'll end the class, and then if you'd like to stay and talk to me, to have a one-on-one conversation, please do. Thank you.
Hello, hi.
Hi, Shani. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good.
I don't know if that the person is still waiting for us to like
Hmm.
I don't know if there's another person. I don't know if that she or he is okay, yeah. Yeah. So my question is about the final paper.
Yes.
So when I see I could see a lot of like numbers. Number one is like first, you were mentioning that I could take one of like could choose one of the questions from the below,
Yeah.
but so I could see one, two, and then I see three highlighted and four, five. So I don't understand like if is it one and two together, one and two, like the question
Well,
one and two is
it's just one question you have to answer. It's just one question. I tried to give as many options as possible, but you're just asked
okay.
to answer one of the questions, or you can create your own theme.
Oh, okay. So that is on the second paper, that is what you mean by design your own topic, the
Yeah.
work that you
Or
provide.
answer one,
Okay.
only one of the questions.
Okay. So if this I am right, so I don't know, I'm gonna ask this because please discuss the construction of race. Why is race such a powerful idea? So that is an like is it a question or that is a statement? Because I could see question number one, that is like a paragraph, and then there I could see please discuss missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada in a scholarly essay with your own original pieces. So that is what
That's
is
the next
confusing
one.
me.
So you can discuss race and general, like one of the questions asks you just to write a general philosophical essay or complete an assignment that just talks about race in general. And another question asks you to specifically talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So it's two separate questions.
Right.
You
Okay.
have to
Okay.
choose,
Or I could design my own topic. So is that what you're saying? If
yeah.
I'm right? Okay. Perfect. I was just seeing a lot of like question one, two, three, and I was like, is it one and two a question that I could choose from one or two, or like I was just a little bit confused.
No, you just have to produce one final assignment and it can answer one of the questions or it can be your own topic. It just really needs to be one solid piece of work,
Okay.
like
Okay.
an essay
Yeah.
or an artistic piece, just one piece of work.
Okay. And also I did heard you that saying whoever submitted the files in email would be graded at the end of this week if I heard
Yeah,
that
by
right.
Friday.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. Well, that would be great. Thank you so much. Thank you for clarifying that. I really appreciate it.
Do you know what you're gonna do for the final assignment?
In the one that I asked you right now, like
Uh,
the
very final assignment. The last
yeah, the final assignment. So I wanted to talk about race and why race is such a powerful idea.
yeah,
Yeah, that is the topic that I wanted to select.
great.
Yeah,
Yeah, feel free to use like any medium you want. If you want to write in whatever way you want, it's fine. Um,
right.
and it's just
Yeah.
very broad questions. You can interpret it.
Yeah, it is. It is very much because I'm a person of color, so
Yeah,
I was thinking about like, putting that a little bit of that too,
sure.
So yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Okay, I'm looking forward to your assignment.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much
Feel free to
for
contact
clarifying that.
any other questions before it's due. Or if you want to meet before it's due, let me know if you have any other questions before.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Okay,
Yeah, I will. Thank you. And
Thank-
our last meeting would be on this coming Thursday. So
yeah, 13.
yeah,
Okay.
okay. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good day.
You too. Bye.